focus a little bit. You know, I think it's worked out as a positive out of kind of a negative. You know.
It's going to be interesting, anyway, especially if I think there was something in the Guardian yesterday going on about how they're expecting like flurries of court cases at the beginning, just as people
of course,
these things out.
It happens with every piece of new legislation that comes in. You know.
1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. Hello everyone, my name is Keenan Brennan from the journal.ie. In 3 days' time, something big is going to hit Ireland, and we're not talking about a referendum. We're talking about the GDPR, the General Data Protection Regulation. What is GDPR, you might ask? Well, it's the biggest data protection regulation to hit the EU in 30 years, and that's since before the internet as we all know it began. So we're going to have a quick conversation about it now and see if we can tease it out. With me is Graham Doyle, Head of Communications with the Data Protection Commissioner. Thanks for being with us, Graham.
Thanks very much, Keenan, for having me.
As always, if you have any comments or observations or stories or questions, stick them in the comments below the video and we'll do our best to get to them. So without further ado, we'll get to it. Okay, Graham, nice easy one to start with. What is GDPR and why does it matter? Why is it important?
Well, I think in your introduction there, you've probably spelled it out yourself, Keenan. It's the General Data Protection Regulations coming in this Friday, 25th of May. What it does is it harmonises the data protection legislation around the EU as has previously been. It has direct effect in all EU member states, so it brings a consistency and, as I say, a harmonised approach. And previously we've had directives that had to be transposed into national member state legislation, but this is different. In terms of does it matter, why does it matter? Well, it puts a big onus on businesses and organisations in terms of how they process personal data, and it also really enhances the rights of individuals in the processing of their personal data.
When you say personal data, what is my personal data?
It's any information relating to you that can identify you in any shape or form. So, for example, it can be your name, your date of birth, your PPS number, your phone number, your IP address if you're on a computer. So it's pretty wide in terms of your personal data. And then the processing of that personal data is pretty much any action that's conducted by organisations almost from the cradle to grave of receiving the information. So whether it's they have your data, it's on the receipt of the data, it's how they store the data, it's if they're deleting or erasing the data. So, you know, processing is very wide as well. But the personal data itself, as I say, it's any information relating to an identified or identifiable individual.
Okay, so that's pretty broad. All right, so midnight strikes on the 24th. What are 3 things that are going to change for the average person who's got a phone and an Instagram and a Facebook account? And that covers probably most of the Irish population, is it?
It probably does, yes. I suppose the big and the key thing in the GDPR is this whole idea of transparency. So if I take it from an organisation's perspective, and then we can talk about the individuals, and I suppose there'll be an obvious link to them. So from an organisation's perspective, there's now a significant requirement on them to be transparent in the processing of the personal data, and therefore from an individual's perspective, how they will see it is, and if you take example of the social media networks, as you touched on a couple of them there, and I'm sure many of the viewers and yourself and like myself have been inundated in recent days and weeks in relation to updated terms
Emails
and conditions, and exactly, yes. So what that is to be transparent to individuals, to let them know, you know, what data is being held on them, how that data is being processed, how it's being controlled, and also to give the individuals more, as I said earlier, enhanced rights. More, they themselves can control settings. You may have seen on some of the social media sites recently. I had a chance to be on one myself, and I was looking at my settings now are all grouped together, so it's very clear for me to see actually what the settings are, where they're at, what the data is that's being held, what it's going to be used for, and I myself then can actually control what way I want that data to be used. So that's one very, very obvious one. A second one then is in relation to the actual consent. So there's strengthened consent obligations under GDPR. So that means, you know, I now have, if an organisation is processing my personal data, and they want to, as an example, if you want to send an email or you want to send a communication, a direct marketing, for example, I now have to give an affirmative action of consent. So I have to confirm that I'm opting in to give my consent to a business or to an organisation, whereas in the past what would happen, and again I'm sure you and the viewers will be familiar, you know, you would have gone on to internet sites, you may have got emails, and it was tick this box if you wish to opt out, whereas as I say it's an affirmative action, and it's now opt in. And I suppose a third area that kind of springs to mind straight away is this whole clear language that people should be seeing, this easier to understand. So all of the privacy policies, the terms and conditions that organisations have, you know, gone should be the days of these 20 to 25 page terms and conditions and privacy policies. They need to be easy to understand for the consumer.
Well, let's put it in practical terms. One thing they say about GDPR is it really empowers people. It gives them so much more control than before. What does it mean practically? Like, I mean, how can I hold a social media company beholden, if that makes sense? Yeah, well, it does. What you do is, as I say, I've gone through some of under the transparency, you know, what they need to be doing, and in terms of if individuals are not satisfied, as has been the case, but if individuals are not satisfied with how their personal data is being processed, they can come to ourselves with, you know, if we're the relevant body, or across the EU go to the relevant data protection authority, and you know they can make a complaint to the authority, and they will be looked at, they will be investigated. In fact, in terms of our own organisation, I'd say the transparency area is going to be one of the areas we're really going to focus on in the early days of GDPR, because as I say, it really is the foundation of GDPR can be seen in the whole transparency and accountability element for organisations. So yes, organisations can go to whether it's a social media company, whether it's, you know, irrespective of what organisation it is. There's also a significant change in terms of what's known as subject access requests. So individuals, we quite often see it, and a huge amount of our complaints, actually somewhere in the region of 52% of our complaints for 2017 related to people who had made subject access requests of organisations.
more commonly it is, say, an employee who's requesting information from the employer in relation to what information is being held on that individual. As I say, 52% of the complaints we got were from people who weren't satisfied that their subject access request was being dealt with. Quite a lot of time it's in time. It used to be 40 days. What GDPR does, it introduces now, it reduced it to 1 month that organisations have to comply with a subject access request. It also does away with the cost. There was a cost of just over €6 for a subject access request. Now, the value may not be a huge amount, but I suppose it was the inconvenience that it put people at. That's now gone as well. So I would expect to see an increase in subject access requests that are made to organisations. So again, it's a very powerful way for individuals to be able to identify and find out what is being held by organisations on them. And again, I go back to the whole transparency and accountability piece with the organisations themselves.
Okay, well, quite apart from the individual, who has been really worried about GDPR is companies. And some of the fines, if you're not aware, fine for contravening the regulation can be as much as €20 million or 4% of
global annual
turnover, I think, isn't it?
It is, yeah.
So could you see companies going to the wall over this?
I don't know, to be honest with you. It's far too early to be I suppose, talking along those lines, Keenan. But yes, you're right. It's up to 20 million or 4% of global annual turnover, whichever is greater. That is the limit of it. It is very significant, yes. And then within the public sector, there are fines of up to 1 million. I suppose what we ourselves will look at is we look at kind of the gravity, the duration, the scope of any breach that there is in terms of us identifying how much of a fine would be imposed on an organisation. Equally, there's also, which is very significant under GDPR, there's this whole idea of compensation, where an individual can take an organisation to task if they're not satisfied with how their data is being processed, and as part of that, for the first time, it introduces compensation for non-material damage. So that's going to be stuff such as reputational damage and so forth. So it is very significant for organisations, and it's our experience has been that we've worked very hard with the organisations over the last couple of years. We've had our own in-house, we've had a GDPR awareness raising and training units established. We've had our own microsite, and again, with anything that I'm speaking about here today, I would advise people to go and look at our microsite, which is www.gdprandu.ie. So we've done an awful lot of work with not only the multinationals, the big companies that are here in Ireland, but also the SMEs and the public sector bodies. We held a conference not too far from here in Dublin Castle back in January to try and get organisations aware and prepared for GDPR. So there's quite a lot of work has gone on, but as you say, it is a significant change for organisations now in terms of the emphasis on the enhancing of the rights of the individual.
Okay, well, to bring it back down to brass tacks again, let's take like a couple of roles in society. So say a politician or a guard or a doctor. Doctors in particular, I've heard, have been tearing their hair out trying to get GDPR compliant. How's it going to affect them day to day?
Again, I go back to the stuff that I mentioned at the very outset, and I don't mean to be repeating myself, but again, it's the transparency piece. They need to be accountable. They need to, if they're processing data, they need to look at the data. What's really important is this whole idea of a risk-based approach. So that's what GDPR is. It's about a risk-based approach for people. So just because you are in a profession, you may not have a huge amount of personal data that you process. So as we say as I say when I'm out and about at conferences and meeting with people, your starting point for data protection is to actually know what data you hold. Like, what is the data that I hold? How do I process the data? And then do a risk analysis as to what risks are there. So in terms of the various professions, I suppose it goes back to, you need to be accountable. So when you are creating anything, whether it be a new system that you're creating, you're looking at things such as what's known as privacy by design and privacy by default. And again, we talk about the social media. We spoke about the social media companies earlier on, and we're talking about this whole idea of privacy by default, where your actual starting point is that you give people privacy, and therefore if they wish to change, say, settings or whatever it may be, they can do that themselves. But it's something that they themselves are doing, as opposed to it being the other way around. But for doctors, for politicians, as you say, for journalists, it's the same. It's the accountability, it's transparency. In some organisations, well, when you're within the public sector, or local authorities or organisations that actually have got large processing of personal data happening. There's a requirement now for what's known as a DPO, which is a data protection officer, to have within the organisation. Every public sector body has them now. So there are significant challenges. As I say, we've been working hard with the various professions over the last number of years.
What has been, all right, so we touched on it earlier, and there's actually a piece on the journal.ie this morning about it, but probably people who've never heard of GDPR have been getting emails recently, possibly from sites that they might have signed up to 10 years ago and had completely forgotten about. What are these emails about?
There's a couple of aspects to them, I suppose. The first aspect would be consent. So, consent needs to be given, it needs to be proven. So people, quite a lot of these companies are now going to seek consent from the individual and to see, is it okay for them to continue whatever it is, whether it be that they're sending you newsletters, whether it be that they're, whatever it is that they're doing with your personal data. So that's the first area. It needs to be freely given, and it needs to be proven that it's been given. The second thing, again, I go back to it, it's the transparency piece. So these organisations right now being transparent and letting people see what it is they're doing with the data. I do think, from a personal perspective, when I look at these quite often, it is a little unfortunate that maybe for quite a lot of the population out there, their first real foray into the whole data protection sphere with GDPR is, oh, I'm getting another one of these letters, or I'm getting another one of these emails. It is something that over time, the requirement won't be there for companies to be doing it.
Do you think companies are maybe going too hard on this? Is it something that has to be done? I
think companies are, dotting every I and crossing every T and making sure that they're meeting up to the requirements as they see, as they see is that they need to do, and informing people. As I say, it can be unfortunate for individuals that they feel they're being bombarded by these emails and letters and so forth. But I suppose, again, the purpose from the companies and the organisation's perspective is, I think, to make sure that they're compliant in terms of transparency and consent in particular.
I mean, one state body that's definitely going to have to deal with GDPR, because there isn't going to be any choice, is your own employer, the Data Protection Commissioner. How do you think she is set up for what's coming?
Well, we're set up well at the moment. We still got a way to go, and no doubt going forward, I suppose, on both the resources and the budgetary front. Resource-wise, there's been an incredible increase in the resources within the organisation. If I go back 3-4 years, 2013-14, we had around 30 staff working in the organisation. We're currently at 100. By the end of this year, we'll be up to 140. With a plan for the end of 2019 to be up to around 180 to 200. We've had a big commitment from government in terms of our funding. Our budget has increased again considerably. We were just under 8 million, around 8 million last year, and we're at 11.7 million for this year. Will
the powers of the Commissioner be greatly enhanced by GDPR?
Well, the introduction, as we mentioned, of the enforcement powers that we have, both corrective and in the form of administrative fines, will be significant. And as the Commissioner herself has said, she will be looking to use, where required, the full force of the powers that she's being given.
Okay, so for the individual, it's a good thing. I think we've got that set. For companies, it's a worrisome time. Do you think there's going to be any wriggle room with this? Is this something that people can maybe fudge a little bit? Or
no, and even for organisations themselves, Keenan, I suppose one of the messages that I'd want to get out is that it's not necessarily something to be worried about either. Yes, you need to prepare, you need to kind of get your house in order, but it should help organisations as well to identify, again, as I say, you do the risk-based approach to this, but it will help organisations identify what personal data they hold. It will help them strengthen the security of their organisations. Should also increase the likes of training of staff around the whole area of data protection. And not forgetting that people who are employees in organisations are also consumers or individuals in a personal capacity. So, it's an important piece of legislation. Yes, it does bring with it a lot of, as I said at the very outset, it brings with it a lot of work to be done by organisations. A lot of work has been done, but there's still an awful lot of work to do for organisations. The 25th of May is the day that GDPR comes in, but it's only the start. It's by far the checkered flag. If anything, it's only the starting flag.
We got some interesting questions in from readers in advance of this, because obviously people have an awful lot of interest in the regulation itself. And they all requested anonymity, which shows that they're up under data protection. But to start off with, an unsolicited email, one of which I actually got not long before this stream began. Will there be penalties if you get one from a company?
Yes, there are penalties. In terms of unsolicited, as I've mentioned, the whole consent issue earlier on. People must give their consent to emails. If I'm getting emails, there must be an option. Even if I have consented, I have the option to withdraw my consent at any time. So again, you'd be familiar with the unsubscribe or opt-out buttons that appear on emails. Where I'm getting emails, and I've asked a company or an organisation, irrespective of who they are, if I ask them to stop sending the emails to me, they must do so. If they don't, and somebody comes to us, it is something that we take. In fact, even without GDPR, we have taken a number of prosecutions in this area, in particular in the area around direct marketing, where people are receiving direct marketing messages, even though they either haven't given their consent or have looked to withdraw their consent, and they continue to get these messages. An important thing, I suppose, for organisations in relation to this is not only do you need to get the consent, but when you've got the consent, as I say, you need to ensure that you give people the option of opting out or withdrawing that consent. And therefore, if you're doing it through email, and you're giving an unsubscribe or opt-out option on the email, make sure that in the background somewhere in the organisation you have somebody who's ensuring that they are indeed actually opting the individuals out, and it's not something that keeps happening. We got a query in from a vet. Okay.
Who a veterinary clinic which had signed customers up to animal vaccine notifications via text message, and they're wondering, do they need to text message everybody in their database now to make sure that they've got confirmation of consent? They haven't heard anything on this from the Vet Council, they say. Okay.
Well, I suppose your starting point is the consent that they currently have. Will it be in accordance, and will it meet the standards set out in GDPR? So I think you said there that they have got the consent of the individuals already to do this. So if they have the consent of the individuals, I would say no. As long as they have that consent in place, that should. But again, they just need to make sure that the consent that has been given has been freely given, provided to them, and it meets the standards of GDPR. And again, similar to what I said just previously, make sure that when you are contacting the individuals now going forward, that you give them the option and continue to give them the option to opt out or to withdraw that consent at any time.
Okay, I think we're coming to a close now, so I just want to ask you one more question. Can you give me an example of a way in which something we take for granted in daily life is going to change on May 25th, like in some fundamental way?
I don't want to give you transparency again, because I've spoken about it a number of times, although it probably is the key area.
Well, we'll just how it'll affect your common garden person.
Yeah, well, I suppose nowadays so many people are on the internet, so many people are using social media, and as I've discussed already, I don't think people a lot of people weren't overly familiar with what was actually happening with their data, what data was held, how it was being processed. Quite a lot of this stuff that's got a lot of discourse in recent months has helped, I think, to raise this issue in the public mind. And what GDPR will do and does do for organisations and for individuals is raise the bar in terms of the transparency, so people in their daily life now should be able to see what's happening with their data.
Okay, so transparency is the watchword.
I think transparency is the key word, yes.
All right, well, look, interesting times ahead. Graham, thanks so much for being with us. I really appreciate it.
Not at all.
And thanks very much for watching. We'll chat to you again.